next speaker is Kimberly Vey. She's a licensed professional counselor at Hillside DBT and happens to be the first in the state of Georgia who was board certified DBT therapist by the Linehan Institute. Extremely intensive and lengthy process, so that kudos to Kim for that. She's also been trained in level 1 and 2 theraplay and group theraplay. She's been working with children, adolescent, and families for about 11 years and has extensive experience in both clinical and educational settings with interpersonal relationships, emotion regulation, self-esteem, which of course are 3 of the 9 criteria of BPD. Her goal is to help her clients learn coping strategies so that they can effectively manage their intense emotions and build what Marshall Linehan and we talk about in the DBT world, a life worth living. That's what we were trying to build for them and for us. She provides DBT in group, individual, and family settings, and she leads adolescent and family skill groups. She also facilitates DBT groups for parents and DBT workshops for clinicians. So help me welcome Dr. Kimberly Vey. And let me find your slide. I'll put this on you.
So this is a thing so I can walk around.
Let's see. Okay.
Where do I put this?
Sorry?
Where do I put this?
Just put it on there any way you like. Okay. You'll have to excuse our... And you know how to advance it?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you. So, Dr. Hoffman and Susan gave a great introduction to a lot of the points that I'm going to touch on today. I want to make this interactive too. I'm going to go through some dialectics and validation, but I also want to do a little bit of activity so that we can put it into practice. I strongly believe that validation is key. That's the huge piece that I think is missing. And I think it's so hard because we're invalidating in a very benign way. We think we're validating, right? Like we think that we're helping because we're problem solvers for the most part, or we just want it to go away. Like we don't want any more crises. So let's just fix this problem. So I think validation is so key in that it's so hard because we don't know that we're not doing it. And with dialectics, the nature of DBT, the dialectical piece of it is huge. When we can focus on the dialectics, we can sort of open everything up to see that there are two opposing things can be true at the same time. And that takes us regulating our emotions to be able to see both sides of that also. So I'm sure you've all had that moment of I love you, I hate you, don't leave me, piece of the BPD diagnoses. And so it's hard to regulate your emotions when you're constantly in that tumultuous relationship of I hate you, but don't go too far. I hate you, but stay right next to me. That whole, we're human, right? Like I think that where Susan said before about being able to say no, I think we can recognize that we're human and it's okay to have emotions, right? Like we want our children to be able to be okay with emotions, and we have to be okay with emotions too. We're just as human, and our emotions are going to go up right along with our children, especially when they know how to get them to go up. So dialectics, it seems simplistic that 2 things can be true at the same time, and it's really hard when emotions are involved. A lot of times it's hard to see where the other side of the truth is. So one thing, my child is having very extreme emotional responses to these situations. It's very hard to see their grain of truth in something that's so out of proportion to a situation, right? Like it's very hard to look at both sides of that. And in DBT, that's where we use the word and. Because when we can separate the two, as opposed to but sort of discounts the first part of that. There's always more than one way to think about a situation. So if you have, your child is emotionally charged on the situation, what is the piece that you're missing on their side of the story, on their perspective of it? The one thing that I always preface with parents that I think is really hard to conceptualize in the moment is that someone's perception is their reality. As skewed as it may be, that's their reality in the moment. And that's where when we get into when we get into validation, we'll see how we can validate that perception and then work on helping them see that it's not reality. So the dialectics offer that balance between acceptance and change. In DBT with the BPD population, there has to be just as much validation with the acceptance and change to get them to be able to thrive in treatment. If not, if too far on one side or the other keeps them stuck and polarized. So as many of you probably see daily, that individuals with BPD have that black or white or all or nothing thinking. So anytime you have that never, always, you're usually stuck and polarized on one side or the other. And either side can be problematic. If you're polarized on your side of the dialectic or the other side, it can be just as problematic. So day to day, dialectics can help us see a situation and be able to solve the problem with more than one way. There's not always a right way, and that sort of goes back to what Susan said. Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Right? Like there's not always, and the challenge again with this is whenever your emotions, you're tired, you're exhausted, your emotions are heightened, I don't want you to run my house anymore. Right? Like you have put me in this situation, you're not going to do this. And when we can identify what our goal is in the situation, then we can be more effective as opposed to being right. So I tell this story. I had a parent in one of my parent groups who he had a really hard time. His child knew how to raise his buttons. He had a very hard time regulating his own emotions. And the child was on a home pass, and he wanted him to take the Legos upstairs because they had company coming over. He said, I want you to put the Legos in the box, take them upstairs. So the child was emotionally sensitive to any type of limits, redirection, any type of directive. And so the child takes a handful of them, walks upstairs. The dad says, no, I said put them in the box, take them upstairs. So of course the kid then takes like 2 and walks upstairs. So as he's doing this, the dad's emotions are raising as the kid is playing off of it, but while his emotions are raising also. So the situation ended not very pleasantly. And then in group, when we were able to process through it and talk about it, if the dad would have identified, it wasn't about how the Legos got upstairs, that he just wanted the Legos upstairs. If he put them in his shirt or if he put them in his mouth, however he got them upstairs would have been okay if the dad would have been able to identify that my goal in this situation is to have the Legos put away. And I think that when our emotions are calm, we can recognize that makes sense, right? But in that moment when we're emotionally charged, no, I said put the Legos in the box and take them upstairs. And so that's where when we can regulate our own emotions and acknowledge that it's okay to have emotions and it's okay to have to use the skills ourselves, then we can identify what is our goal in this situation. And the key is that the goal in this situation doesn't have to be the goal all the time. So just because he's going to take them up the way he wants to this time doesn't mean that has to be like that all the time. So when we can look at both sides, then it can help us problem solve more effectively. So now, validation. Validation is the key to treating BPD with the acceptance and change. Our population has behaviors that are extremely ineffective that work. And so when I have had a client who I've said, it makes total sense. And she's looking at me like, what? It makes sense why you're doing that. And we have to figure out a more effective way. But when you can just validate, sometimes it just disarms that emotion and it disarms that fight or flight response. Because a lot of their responses are so out of proportion to a situation that it's hard to find the balance. It's hard to find where is that dialectic in this situation. And when we look at, let me go back to this side. looking for the similarities as opposed to the differences. Looking for what are the similarities in this situation, what are the similarities with my child, as opposed to always focusing on the differences, which will help us look at what are both sides of that. Does somebody want to give an example of a dialectic that is difficult to find the other side, that's hard to figure out what I'm missing on that side? Anybody have a? No? Yes.
I don't know if this is correct. So I asked my daughter to do chores, and she has until X time to finish them, but she still won't do them.
And she won't do them.
And she won't do them during that whole time. So if I remind her it's getting to be the time that you need to have the chore done, she probably won't do even more. That's all I got to share.
So the key with finding the dialectic on the other side is you don't have to agree with it. It doesn't. The grain of truth on the other side is she's having a hard time following directions, doing her chores. So it's not about problem solving it. It's about finding that side, and she needs to learn to be able to do her chores. So it helps to just not stay polarized on one side. When we stay polarized on she needs to learn how to do her chores, it charges our emotions, as opposed to being able to say she is really struggling with following directions and being able to do things in a timely manner, and that's something that she needs to continue to work on. So it doesn't solve the problem. It just helps us not be emotionally charged around the situation. A lot of time, and then if we got polarized on the side of she's struggling not doing her chores in a timely manner, then we lose sight of the other side. So being polarized on either side is problematic. Does that make sense? Did you have a question?
Would we go into our discussion to discuss what the next steps would be when she realized they're struggling?
The validation. So just stop me if anything jogs your memory or if you want to chime in. So when we go into validation, like I said, with BPD, the extreme behaviors, the extreme responses to what seem to be very minimal situations to us are huge to them and very invalidating when we try to solve their problems for them. When we look at validation as a whole in society, if you think about society in general, it's very invalidating, right? Like there's very little validation of your emotional experience, because especially when there's a behavior attached to it. And that's where I think being in the school system is huge, because this is a huge piece that's missed in the school system, because a lot of the responses are responses to a behavior, right? The response is to what is observed as opposed to what is being experienced. And yes, that still needs to be addressed. It doesn't take away from addressing that behavior, but we have to first be able to validate where that behavior is coming from. What is charging that behavior? What is the emotional experience of that individual that is resulting in that extreme behavior? And that's the piece that with society today, where things move so quickly and everything is just so quick, it's hard to stop and look at the emotional experience as opposed to just the behavior. Yes?
I guess what I'm asking is what you do after you validate them.
Yes, that's what we're going to...
I know, okay.
Oh, so yeah, so after you validate them, that's when you work on the problem solving.
Okay.
So I'm going to can we watch? Does the video work? I'm going to see if this video works. Maybe not. Okay, that's fine. What am I thinking? Oh, okay, that's fine. So a lot of times, when we look at validation, we feel like we're validating when we want to offer help, right? Like we want to offer solutions. Because a lot of times the problems, not the overarching problem, but the problems that your children come to daily, a lot of times we have the solutions to them. right? Like, she won't return my phone call. Okay, well, let's just give it, be patient, give it time. She'll call you back. Maybe she's talking to somebody, right? Like, a lot of times we have the solutions. Their responses are so out of proportion, it questions it. And so, again, we look at, it's twofold. We're problem solvers, and sometimes we just want to avoid a bigger crisis, right? Like, if we can solve this problem, then it can avoid the crises. When we can validate the emotional experience, not validate the behavior, when we validate the emotional experience, sometimes it disarms the intensity of the emotion. So it's like, oh, you hear that I'm struggling. You're not validating the behavior that's associated with it. So I want to do a short activity. I need 5 volunteers that are just going to, there's a fear written on this card, and you're going to write or say a validating statement to this fear. There's no judgments, there's no judgment. Anybody want to? Thanks, Renee. So look at the fear, and what would your first reaction be if you had if your child or you had a family member? Oh, one more. No, want to do it? No, okay, that's fine. Okay, if you had a child or a family member that came to you and expressed this fear, what your response would be, and there's no judgment. Who would like to go first? Renee.
Mine is spiders, and I think that I would start by saying, wow, I understand that you're really afraid of spiders, and that makes sense to me because they have a lot of legs and they can go everywhere, and then I might ask them more about what it is about the spiders that particularly that bother them. Or
Okay.
whatever.
So I have dogs, so I'd probably say something like, me too. And it's probably because we had that experience, whatever. But not all dogs are the same, and something like that.
Okay.
I had heights, and I would definitely validate that I too am afraid of heights. And I could see why, or what was your experience with it. So making it real.
Yeah, it's interesting I got this because my daughter and I were in a car accident on the highway months ago, and she has this fear, driving on the highway. So the way I handle it is I just try to explain to her that it's going to be okay, that, we're just going to take time, and if we need to find an alternative route, we can do that. And she'll close her eyes, like if she gets nervous on the highway, she'll put her hands over her eyes, and I just let her know it's okay to do that.
Okay. Does she respond well to that?
We're getting almost to the point where she won't close her eyes. It's only with me. As long as Dad's driving, she's fine. But
Okay.
she doesn't want my driving anymore.
Okay.
Okay, mine was public speaking. I don't have a problem with public speaking. But if I was speaking to our son about it, I would say, well, first of all, yeah, I know that can be kind of scary to get up in front of a lot of people. But let's talk about the topic you're going to discuss. If it's sharks, well, this kid knows everything about sharks and everything that swims in the ocean. And go, okay, well, you know a lot about sharks, you're comfortable talking about that. And let's think about the kind of people you're talking to. They're interested in hearing about sharks. So, will that help you?
Okay.
Make you not feel as nervous? Now, let me also put in a footnote here. That's kind of how I approach a lot of things with him. But that can potentially blow up.
Yes.
And it does. And it's like, how far do I go or where do I stop? I mean, I can say, yeah, public speaking can be scary. Yeah, your mother certainly can't do public speaking. She's afraid of it. I used to be afraid of it. And do I just stop there?
So that's where,
Or do I say, hey, let's talk about the subject, which is sharks?
so that's where, great question. When you validate the experience, and I will say be careful with using the word understand. I worked in a school system with gang members, and I had a middle school child who was initiated into a gang and was talking to me about it, and I said, I understand how hard that is. And he looked at me and he said, really? Like, how do you understand what it's like to be in a gang? And I lost him, because at that point, I had no validity for him. I had no, you're just saying whatever you think I want to hear. Because he was intuitive enough to know that I don't understand. I wanted him, I think I just thought that would make him feel better. I don't know what I was thinking then. So I would be careful. And sometimes you can say I understand, because sometimes you can understand. But sometimes it can be, really? Well, how? And then you can lose them at that point. But when we validate the emotional experience, so most of you did validate the emotional experience, as opposed to, well, it's going to be okay, right? Like that's where the invalidation comes in. I personally have a fear of, I don't like clowns. And so someone could easily say, like, they're not going to hurt you. That doesn't make me feel any better. Yes?
Also, one thing I've learned is not to just validate and go straight to problem solving, because it's kind of a yes but.
Mm-hmm.
And validation and validate.
Yes.
Validation. You don't stay with validation enough and you use it. You're not really there and present with the validation, that you use it as a
Seems very artificial.
use as a ploy to get to the problem solving
Mm-hmm.
process. They can really pick up.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I'm going to validate you, so shut up and then you can get the problem solved.
Yeah.
Or you just go into problem solving right away. I think it just needs some time to, that soak in a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And just get a lot, because whenever our children with BPD have such an intense emotional experience that feels unsurvivable sometimes. And that's hard for a lot of us to conceptualize when we haven't experienced an emotion that we thought we were going to die from. Right? Like I had a girl who, she had an interaction with her dad. She had hidden some sharp items in her room. Her dad found them, and when we were doing the behavior train on her dad approaching her, and I said, well, what was your emotion at that point when dad approached me? I was going to die. And then the chain was on, she had self-harm. She felt like she was going to die in that moment. And so if I would have just said, like, an emotion can't kill you, that was not going to help her. Like, there had to be a lot of validation around why she was what she was experiencing. So yes, that's important to keep with the validation long enough to not just make it a little segue into problem solving.
What if they don't even tell you what you're scared about? I mean, at least here, you're saying this public speaking,
Yeah.
clowns, whatever it is, but you can't even get to a starting point.
So that's where you can just validate the emotional experience of what you're observing. Right? You can't describe something that you don't observe with your senses.
So if you say you look scared, or are you scared?
So I can tell that something is really bothering you right now. And that's where then you can, after you validate, then you can go into the problem solving. So I can tell that something is really bothering you right now. This is really hard for you to get up and do this public speaking. Yeah, it really is hard. Like, I don't think I can do it. It must be hard to feel like you have to do something that you don't feel like you can do. I wonder if we could try this. And so the problem solving then becomes more of suggestions. Nope, that's not going to work. Okay, what if we tried this? As opposed to just do this or just do this. And that's the hard part, because we have the do this, right? Like, we have the solution.
Right.
Just, you're afraid of spiders, so just walk around them when you see them, right? Or just avoid going to the circus. As opposed to having them come up with that, and that's that piece of empowerment too, that they can solve their own problems. They do have the ability to solve their problems with the support and the coaching and their emotions are real and valid. Yes.
I was just thinking back to what you said about that. I understand when you said about the game, but I think even in a lot broader, it's pretty obvious you didn't.
Yeah, obvious that I don't understand.
But even if it's things like grief or some family issues or something, unless you've had really truly been in exactly those same shoes, people are going to say, you can't possibly know what my grief is like. Or you can't, that's kind of a,
Even with peers, right?
yeah, or you can't possibly know. It takes a little bit more. And so I think we have to be careful using that word, I understand.
Yeah, like when your child comes home from school and says, I have no friends. Nobody likes me. I'm never going to make friends. You know, if you were to validate, like our initial response would be, yes, you do. And then you start going into the whole, remember you had so-and-so over the other day, you had so-and-so over the other day, and you start to like fact check them. Or I understand it must be hard, really, because you have dad, you have, and so, yeah, that's right. To be able to look at that as in more of a broader perspective, yes.
I think for those situations that I'm really sorry that happened to you, and I'm really sorry you feel that way, are the two things that we use a lot in our family. And it's embrace, because, yeah, we can't always be identifying with their pain, but you can certainly empathize with them.
One thing that I'd say is, instead of I understand, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine what that must be like.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yes.
I like to use I hear you are feeling this way, and I also think it's important to match their emotional intensity around it. And I found that I have twin 3-year-olds, and they can throw down in a heartbeat. So if I can match their emotional intensity, I can sometimes get them to avoid a full tantrum. If I can really empathize with them and be like, you are mad right now, and I get that, then they really know that I know what they're feeling.
And it helps to teach them that emotions are okay. It's okay to have emotions. It's okay to have intense emotions. Yes.
How do you handle, like, with my daughter, she gets very irrational. So even when I try to validate, I get a supercharged response, and it's, you don't get me, you don't understand me, and she's just like very black and white. Like, she won't even consider anything that I'm saying, as a positive or a validation, because she's decided that I don't get her.
And in that,
She's sticking with it.
and that's where I think some of the other DBT skills, I think Cynthia is doing more on DBT today, right? Some of the other DBT skills that sometimes they need to do like, let's bring your emotions down a little bit before I can even have this interaction with you. Not you wouldn't say that like that to them, but helping them in doing some other things to bring those emotions down, because in that moment, they aren't hearing you, right? Like, again, in that moment, their perception is their reality, and it's, rationalizing with an irrational situation is just it's just going to raise your emotions, and then that's where we get more invalidating, because it becomes very frustrating. So I think that's where them recognizing that, I'm not able to hear this right now. And sometimes that takes us helping them.
I have a daughter who's been through the DBT classes twice, and I can reason with her a little bit. And one thing I told her was, okay, that neural pathway to your brain that controls emotion, that controls your learning. And right now, it's clogged. What can you do to unclog it? Because nothing's getting through. And sometimes she'll.
And you can validate that
Yes.
I totally get it. Like, you're not hearing anything I'm saying right now.
Then she'll go to her skills. She'll take a shower. She'll bake. She'll do
Yeah.
something.
Did you have something?
Oh, I was just gonna say it's always fun with my daughter when she says, "Don't give me that validation."
Yeah. And I like that the validation authenticates their internal experience, because when they have such intense emotions, there's something wrong with me. I'm the only one that feels this. And that's where I think matching that emotion can be helpful too, because it shows them that they're not the only one with emotions, and that you can have intense emotions and regulate them. I can have intense emotions and high self-harm urges and use skills to resist, right? Like, so it doesn't, both sides are true. So in order for us to validate others, These are the skills that are needed. Mindfulness. Kabat-Zinn says there's a 60 Minutes episode on mindfulness, and he's called the mindfulness guru at Google, and he says that a productive mind is an uneducated mind, one that's not filled, not full of all that internal conflict. You can reason with a mind that's more mindfulness as opposed to being mindful, right? Like full of as opposed to being mindfulness. So being able to do something to just bring those emotions down a little bit, to be more mindful, aware of what's going on in that moment. Dialectical thinking, seeing both sides. Compassion. We have to find some compassion in some situations that it may be very hard to find compassion in, right? Like there are situations that it could be really hard to find that compassion, and that's the piece of dialectic, to look for, what am I missing? When you lose that compassion piece, what am I missing? What is missing here that I have no compassion over this situation? And being able to validate yourself, which we're going to get into, being able to validate yourself and acknowledge that I'm struggling with this. This is really making me angry. I'm having a hard time being okay with this and even helping my child. Respecting and accepting differences, regulating your own emotions, and then willingness to practice. So what we're going to spend most of the time on is there's 6, Marshall Linehan in DBT there's been created 6 levels of validation. The most basic, level 1, going down to level 6. And as we're going through these levels, they're going to be different for different situations. Some are going to be more applicable to certain situations where others will not be. Level 1 is just that basic staying awake. That basic, I'm in the same room as you. I'm hearing you. When I ask a lot of my clients what validation means to them, they'll say making eye contact. Right? Like, that's staying awake. I'm looking at you. I might nod my head every once in a while. I might respond. That's just that basic level 1. Level 2, I think this one is the one that a lot of times the kids will come back at it and say, stop therapizing me. Stop using all that therapy stuff on me. When you say, what I hear you saying is, right? Like, that's usually when they say, stop it. But just communicating to that person that you've heard them accurately. And this could be with words or nonverbal, right? Like, it can just be that true compassion of, I get it. Like, where you're leaning in and just like with them in that, that's getting them to hear that you're hearing what they're saying. Level 3, stating the unarticulated. This one is, I think, for the clinician, sometimes works a little easier than the child, especially when you're in a emotional situation with your child. If you try to guess what emotion they're experiencing, even if it's right, they're probably going to tell you it's not. Right? Like, so I can tell that this is making you sad. I'm not sad. Stop trying to act like you know what I'm feeling. Right? Like, but in a therapy session, sometimes it can be like, oh, you got it, because there's not that emotional connection. So sometimes that can be challenging for a parent, depending on the situation of your child, because they can feel like, here you go again. You act like you know what's happening. Level 4. This one would go to your situation with the car. Is being able to validate in terms of personal history. So it makes sense that you're afraid to go on the highway, given what has happened to you, right? Like, as opposed to, there's nothing to worry about. It's not going to happen again, right? Like, even, being afraid of planes. Those statistics that you have a higher chance of dying with being struck by lightning than dying in a plane crash, right? Like, if you just heard on the news about a plane crashing, that's probably not going to help, right? Like, it makes sense that you're afraid of that, given you just saw that on TV, or, that your child comes home and I have no friends, nobody likes me. Well, it makes sense because the last school that we were at, you had a really hard time making friends. So being able to validate given their history, giving what happened to them in the past. Or their own biology. A lot of times we lose sight of that biological component, right? Like, there's a temperament. Everybody's born with that temperament. An emotionally charged child as an adolescent probably was emotionally charged as an infant and as a toddler, right? Like, it makes sense that you're having a really hard time with this because it's hard for you to deal with sadness. It's hard for you to regulate those emotions. Level 5, normalizing. I initially had a hard time with this one because I was afraid that it come off as minimizing, where you're saying that a lot of people in your situation would feel the same way. I had a young lady at the hospital who her mother was incarcerated after she was admitted, a couple months after she was admitted. And I had a really hard time with using this level with her because I thought that it was saying that it's no big deal, everybody feels this way. Like, that's the way that I was afraid that it was going to come off. And it was so powerful to have her to be able to for her to be able to hear that a lot of people, most people that had this happen to you would be just as sad. They would feel just as hurt. It would be just as hard for them. It sort of like gives them that, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. It's okay to feel this way, right? Because they have that internal conflict. There's something wrong with me. Why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't be this sad. I shouldn't be this upset. So being able to normalize that given, whatever the situation is. And that's where you could go with, it makes sense that you're really upset that your friend didn't call you back. And then that's when you're going into, okay, so what can we do differently next time as opposed to that response that you had the first time? So you want to validate it and then help them problem solve it. And that's where, with validation, it's really important to not just leave it at that. Especially with, like I said, their perception is their reality. You want to validate that that's what they're experiencing, and we also want to teach them that that's not the reality. You want to help them problem solve. And then level 6 is just that radical genuineness. I personally think that this is what really attracts me to DBT, is I can be real with my clients. I can be there. The client that I had whose mom went to prison, I cried with her in session. I get it. Like, this is just as hard for me as it is for you. Not in that way, but for me to tell you this is just as hard for me to have to tell you. I don't want to tell you this. I want to act like this didn't happen. I want to act like this, I want to just go on to something new, right? And so being able to not have that, I'm the therapist, you're the client, you're just bouncing things off to me, and I'm this, emotionally dull individual, where you can be with them in that emotion so that they can see that it's real. And that's where then they can start to problem solve once they can recognize that, okay, so I'm okay. It's okay that I'm feeling this way, so now I can help the problem solve with how I can handle this more effectively.
Is that the same as empathizing?
Yes, in a way, yeah. And I think, as clinicians, that's something that's just hard because you're supposed to, we're not supposed to show emotions, and that's where there's that barrier there. Whereas it's, I messed up. If I have to tell a client that I messed up, or whatever the situation is, where it makes sense that you're feeling this way. I messed up. I should have done something differently, right? So there's that very normalized where it's twofold. They can see that other people experience emotions too, and that, it's more of a genuine connection. So validating your loved one's emotions helps to reduce that steam, disarm the emotion, sort of gives them that sigh of relief. I can feel this emotion. It's okay that I feel this emotion. And I get it. It's not that easy. It doesn't just disarm it and now everything is fine. So the last piece that is equally important is being able to validate our own emotions, right? It sort of goes back to that putting your mask on first on the plane so that you can help somebody else. If we can't validate ourselves, it's going to be really hard for us to validate our child. So levels 1, 2, and 3 typically don't work too well when we're trying to validate ourselves. Level 4 and 5 can help us be able to validate ourselves with, it makes sense why I'm so angry or I'm so upset and worried about my child, because the last time they ran away or they did this, this happened. Or when the last time they had, the friends didn't call them back from school, they harmed themselves. So being able to tell yourself it's okay that I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling. It makes sense why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. And it doesn't get that emotional arousal of where you're, what's wrong with me? I need to get it together, right? Like I got to figure this out. So you have to first validate yourself too before you can get to that point. So with level 4, given how she has responded in the past, it makes sense that I'm anxious about her safety. As opposed to judging yourself and questioning yourself, why am I acting this way? Why am I feeling this way? Just saying, it's okay. This is why I'm feeling this way. And then the level 5, that you're angry with them because you care about and that's what parents do, right? Like that, it makes total sense. I have one client that says, I guarantee, she says, I bet you're going to say it makes total sense. Because it makes total sense why you wanted to do whatever the behavior was, because you thought you were going to die from that emotion, right? Like if I thought I was going to die from something, I want to get rid of it, right? Like same thing with your body. I always use the analogy of running, right? If you go out and you run and you're trying to do a 5-minute mile, your body's going to slow down. It's going to stop when it gets that hurt, like when it starts to hurt. And the same thing with emotions. When your emotions get so high, when you haven't learned over the year, the validation piece of the invalidating environment over the years, when that emotion gets so high, your body is telling you something. It kicks that fight or flight instinct in to do something to get rid of this emotion. So in a nutshell, with BPD, validation is one of the most important pieces to getting emotions to be regulated, to be able to get your child or your loved one to see that it makes sense. It's okay to have emotions. It's okay to feel this way. That there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with having an emotion. We don't ever say negative or positive emotions. They're wanted or unwanted, because there isn't a negative emotion. Right? Like our kids, I can't be angry. Angry's bad. Angry gets me in trouble. And so they put up that wall that anger is bad. There's something wrong with being angry, whereas it's just an unwanted emotion. We have a girl now who joy is an unwanted emotion. Feeling joy is super hard for her. She has that abandonment feeling. If I get too close or I have too much joy, they're going to abandon me. They're going to leave me. So she keeps that push-pull relationship. And then being able to use the highest level of validation to get the most genuine response. That's it. Any questions? Yes. Okay. Any questions, comments? Yes.
Well, I know you have to validate and try to get their shoes, but what if you really do hear things like, I want to take that boy Johnny and I want to poke him in the eye, see him bleed, and cut his body into a million parts and send it off to his relatives. How are you supposed to take that?
Sounds like you really are upset with Johnny. Like it sounds like Johnny has pushed you over the edge.
Okay.
And I'm wondering how that's going to turn out for you, if that happens.
Okay.
Right? Like so.
It's usually some fictitious person. It's not like it's somebody we even know. I mean, like him using Johnny's like, who is Johnny? I mean,
So is he like relating it to somebody?
It could be sometimes.
Or
it's somebody in the past who did him wrong. He says, I was friendly to him, but then he didn't call me back, so he's doing me wrong. Or I stood up for him, but he won't stand up for me. So he's not a good friend. So I'm going to show him.
And it's hard to have friends who don't reciprocate the same thing that we do, and that's a quality that we don't want to change in you, right? Like we want you to be able to continue to be that way, and sometimes there's going to be Johnnies in the world, right? Like, and it's okay to be angry at them Johnnies in the world, but we can't slash their eyes out and do that. And that's where, depending on now, if your child is on the spectrum, it doesn't work. I've tried it in a moment of, I didn't know what else to do. But using irreverence can help too. Being able to just use a little bit of humor, a little bit of reverence to just knock off some of that emotion. But on the spectrum, they take it literally. A lot of times that black and white. So be able to disarm that emotion, however, with helping them problem solve. But I think, if you can, again, looking at the dialectic, what am I missing? He's angry at somebody, right? Like something is really bothering him. And so you're not validating what he wants to do to this person. You're validating that somebody has made him really mad.
Okay.
And that's the hardest part with a parent validation is how do I validate something that's not valid, right? Like you don't validate the invalid, but you can validate the emotional experience. An emotional experience is never invalid. It's real. The behavior, you're not validating. You're validating what they're experiencing. Did you have a question? Yes.
So what my daughter tends to do is completely shut us out. So it's like talking to a brick wall. So you can tell she's furious. She may have already torn up something in her room. And so I try to validate and try to guess at what she's so upset about, but it's talking to a brick wall. So how long do I keep trying to say I get what she might be experiencing or try guessing at it before I just walk out of the room and say, okay, let me know when you want to talk? I struggle with how much do I keep feeding the brick
You might not validate it all at first.
Okay.
You might just say, and when she's in a calm space, that's when you want to be able to problem solve with her. Okay, so when you're experiencing this, I get it. When I'm trying to talk to you, it's not working. It's making it worse. So what do you need from me in that moment to be able to calm down? Right? Like when they're calm. So whenever you go to your room and you start throwing things around, it makes me really worried and maybe even a little bit angry. And I get that when I come into the room to try to talk to you, it just makes things worse. So what do you need from me in that moment to be able to calm down so that we can have a conversation? So a lot of those conversations are done when they're not in that space. So that, remember when we talked the other day, we said, I'm going to give you some time in your room when in 5 minutes, I'm going to knock on your door and we're going to see if we're ready. And so being able to, but it's the empowerment of them having a say in what that looks like.
Yeah, we found that she'll pass us notes. So she'll write it all down and then we'll find it on her pillow or it'll suddenly slide up in front of her door. And so then we'll read that and then we'll write it back. And that seems to be the only way that works right now.
Yeah, and I think that's that's where those type of solutions happen in a moment of being calm, right? Like, so as opposed to, what do you need from me right now? As she's punching holes in the wall or destroying her room, right? Like, she probably doesn't need much from you, right? Like, so where I think a lot of times we, in the moment, try to fix it. And sometimes we just have to be okay with not fixing.
Kimberly, for